Hold on a second. This is 2018. Let's get some color up on this. There we go. Now I can actually see what we're doing here. Good evening. It is I, Martino Jinx, friend to many, enemy to few, and I want to say thank you for joining our stream tonight. This wouldn't be possible without the donations from a number of really great people out there in our community. We raised $500 for Toys for Tots, and I said that I would do a live stream of a reading of A Christmas Carol. Well, here it is. So why don't you cozy yourself up to my digital fire, get yourself a glass of nog or perhaps some rum. Hell, if you're so inclined, light yourself up a blunt. Because we're going to be here for a little while. And with that, I give you A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Now, I won't be going through any of the prefacing. We're just going to get right into it. We've got 93 pages of pure literary bliss to be reading through. Chapter 1, Christmas Carol, Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was put upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge that there's a particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in this trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How else could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night, in an easterly wind, upon his own ramparts, than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Now, Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterwards, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. But he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, retching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck of generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheeks, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and now his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. No external heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he, no falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the streets to say, with handsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, would tug on their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, Dark Master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked. To edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones called nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggily dismal, and he could hear the people upon the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and the candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices like ruddy smears upon a palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and it was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by and was brewing on a large scale. Now, the door of Scrooge's counting house was open that he might keep an eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond a sort of tank was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller than it looked, like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, so Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. It was so surely, as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. Intimation. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and the breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas. What right do you have to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Oh, come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right do you have to be dismal? What reason do you have to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, just said "Bah!" again, followed up with "Humbug." "Don't be cross, Uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be?" returned the uncle, "when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas! Out upon Merry Christmas! What Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item in 'em through a round dozen of months presented dead against you. If I could work my will, said Scrooge indignantly, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart, should. Uncle, pleaded his nephew. Nephew, returned the uncle sternly. Keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine. Keep it, repeated Scrooge's nephew. But you don't keep it. Let me leave it alone then, said Scrooge. Much good may it do to you, much good it has ever done you. There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say. Return the nephew. I think I got that wrong. Christmas among the rest, but I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, uncle, it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket. I believe that it has done me good and will do me good, and I say God bless it. Got the characters figured out here. The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately insensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. Let me hear another sound from you, said Scrooge, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a very powerful speaker, sir, he said, turning to his nephew. I wonder you don't go into Parliament. Don't be angry, uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow. Scrooge said he would see him, yes. Indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. But why? Cried Scrooge's nephew. Why? Why did you get married? Because I fell in love. Because you fell in love, growled Scrooge, as if that were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. Good afternoon. Nay, uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it a reason for not coming now? Good afternoon, said Scrooge. I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends? Good afternoon, said Scrooge. I am sorry with all of my heart to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party, but I have made the trial and homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So a Merry Christmas, uncle. Good afternoon, said Scrooge, and a Happy New Year. Good afternoon, said Scrooge. Now his nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow a greeting of season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, and he returned them cordially. Ah, there's another fellow, muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. My clerk with 15 shillings a week, a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam. This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let two other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to him. Scrooge and Marley, I believe, said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. I have the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley. Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years, Scrooge replied. He died 7 years ago this very night. We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner, said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been two kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back. At this festive time of year, Mr. Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking up a pen, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some light provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessities, hundreds of thousands in want of common comforts, sir. Are there no prisons? Well, there's plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. And the union workhouses? Demanded Scrooge. Are they still in operation? Well, they are still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say they were not. The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigour, then, said Scrooge. Oh, both very busy, sir. Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course, said Scrooge. Very glad to hear it. Under the impression that they scarcely furnished Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, returned the gentleman, a few of us endeavour to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We chose this time because it is a time, of all others, when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for? Nothing, Scrooge replied. You wish to remain anonymous. I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there. Many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that. But you might know it, observed the gentleman. It's not my business, Scrooge returned. It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue the point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labours with an improved opinion of himself and in a more fastidious temper than was usual with him. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before the horse and carriages and conduct them on their ways. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible, and struck the hours and quarters in the clouds with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if the teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. The cold became intense. In the main street, at the corner of the court, some labourers were repairing the gas pipes, and had lighted a great fire in a brazier, round which with a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. The water plug being left in solitude, its overflowing suddenly congealed and turned into misanthropic ice. The brightness of the shops, where holly sprigs and berries crackled in the lamp heat of the windows, made pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers and grocers' trades became a splendid joke, a glorious pageant, with which it was next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do. The Lord Mayor, in the stronghold of the mighty mansion house, gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as a Lord Mayor's household should. And even the little tailor, whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, while his lean wife and baby sallied out to buy the beef. Foggier yet, and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. If the good St. Dunstan had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed he would have roared a lusty purpose. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay. Scrooge sees the ruler of such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At last, the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tactfully admitted the fact to an expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop a half-a-crown for it, you think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wage for no work." The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his great coat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning." The clerk promised he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no great coat, went down a slide on Cornhill, and at the end of the lane of boys, 20 times in honor of it being Christmas Eve, and ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at Blind Man's Bluff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his bank book, he went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. There were a gloomy suite of rooms, in a lowering pile of building up a yard where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a younger house, playing at hide-and-seek with other houses, and have forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge. The other rooms all lit out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Now, it is a fact that there is nothing at all particular about the knocker on this door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it, night and morning, during his whole residence in that place. Also that Scrooge had as little of what called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporations, aldermen, and livery. Let it also be borne of mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since last mention of the 7-year dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was an impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with the ghostly spectacles turned up on the ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were made perfectly motionless. That, and in its livid color, made it horrible. But its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control rather than part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key that he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause, with a moment's irresolution, before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind at first, as if he had half expected to be terrified by the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hole. But there was nothing on the back of the door except for the screws and nuts that held on the knocker, so he said, "Pooh, pooh," and then closed the door with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened his door, walked across the hall, and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candles as he went. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs, or through a bad young Act of Parliament. But I mean to say you can have got a hearse up that staircase and taken it broadways with the splinter bars towards the wall and the door towards a balustrades, and done it easily. There was plenty of width for that, and no room to spare, for which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out in the street wouldn't have lighted the entryway too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and a little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head. Upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in the dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fire guard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, a washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed. Nothing on such a bitter night. He obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract. Oh, got a donation. Wonderful, thank you. It was a very low fire indeed. Nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all around with quaint Dutch tiles, designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, pharaohs, daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers, descending through the air on clouds like featherbeds. Abrahams, Belshazzars, apostles putting off to sea in butterboats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. And yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod, swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been blank at first, with power to shape some pictures on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one of them. "Hamburg," said Scrooge as he walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell, that hung in the room and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that, as he looked, he saw this bell began to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound. But soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed like an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard the ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. A cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and he heard the noise much louder on the floors below. Then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "Ah, it's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door and passed into his room before his eyes. Upon its coming, and the dying flame leaped up, as though it cried, "I know him, it's Marley's ghost," and fell again. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, his usual waistcoat, tights, and boots. The tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail, and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long, and wound about him like a tail. And it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him, was looking through his waistcoat. He could see the two buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels. Let's try that again. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its cold, dead eyes and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound to its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before. He was still incredulous and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge in a caustic as cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much," said Marley's voice. I'm kidding, I'm not going to do it. "Much," Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade," he was going to say, to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost was so transparent might find himself in the condition to take a chair, and felt that the event of it being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace as if he was quite used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more gravy than grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel, in his heart, by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart, as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror. But the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit, staring at those fixed glazed eyes in silence for a moment, would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel in himself, but this was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were agitated by the hot vapor from the oven. "You see this toothpick?" said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge, for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself. I do. You're not looking at it, said Scrooge. But I see it, said the ghost, notwithstanding. Well, returned Scrooge, I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug. At this the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling voice that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror than when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its jaw dropped upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hand before his face. Mercy! Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? Man of worldly mind, replied the ghost, do you believe in me or not? Probably be like, his jaws on his chest. I do, said Scrooge, I must, but why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me? It is required of every man, the ghost returned, that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander the world. Oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turn to happiness. Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chain, and wrung its shadowy hands. You are fettered, said Scrooge, trembling. Tell me why. I wear the chain I forged in life, replied the ghost. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it of my own free will, and my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? Scrooge trembled more and more. Would you know, pursued the ghost, the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You've labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain. Getting a little dry here. Scrooge glanced about him. We're going to take a break here in a second, guys. We're about a quarter of the way in. Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, and in expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. Jacob, he said imploringly. Oh, Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob. I have none to give, the ghost replied. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and it is conveyed by other ministers to others kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitting to me. I cannot rest, I cannot stay, I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me, in life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets. Pondering what the ghost had said, he did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. You must have been very slow about it, Jacob, Scrooge observed in a businesslike manner, though with humility and deference. Slow? 7 years dead, mused Scrooge, and travelling all the time. The whole time, said the ghost. No rest, no peace, incessant torture or remorse. You travel fast? Said Scrooge. On the wings of the wind, replied the ghost. You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years, said Scrooge. The
The ghost, upon hearing this, set up another cry and clanked his chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. "Oh, captive bound in double iron," cried the phantom, "not to know the ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures, for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunities misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I."
"But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself.
"Business!" cried the ghost, wringing his hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and the benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in a comprehensive ocean of my business."
It held up its chains at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground. "At this time of the rolling year," the spectre said,
"I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?"
Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me," cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone."
"Oh, hear me," cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone."
"I will," said Scrooge. "But don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob. Pray. How is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see? I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day." It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. "That is no light part of my penance," pursued the ghost. "I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer." "You always were a good friend to me," said Scrooge. "Thank ye."
"You will be haunted," resumed the ghost, "by 3 spirits."
Ooh la la.
Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost had done.
It's that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob," he demanded in a faltering voice.
"It is."
I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge.
"Without their visits," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1.
"Couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it over, Jacob?" hinted Scrooge.
"Expect the second on the night next at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us."
When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table, bound round its head as before. Scrooge knew by the smart sound its teeth made that when the jaws were brought together by the bandage, he ventured to raise his eyes again and found the supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude. Oh my! With his chain wound over and about its arm, the apparition walked backwards from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped, not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the rising of his hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret. Wailings,
inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in a mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. He looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost, but some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together, but none were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost, in a white waistcoat with a monstrous iron safe attached to his ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with her infant, whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was, clearly, that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost the power forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirits faded together, voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he had walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was still double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable, and being, from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, he went straight to bed, without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. End of stave 1. So, I'm just going to take a second here to make sure that we actually still have, 8:27. Can somebody give me a check-in that you guys can see me okay from the chat? No, he's not joining. Well, let's go ahead and hit play. Okay. Oh, no, looks like I can see myself. Okay. Well, if you could afford me a moment, I need to put some more digital logs on the fire. These are the best types of logs, very clean burning. Piss right through my data cap, though. That ought to do it. I do love the smell of birch. I'll let you guys watch this just for a second. I need to go get myself a glass of water. Kind of forgot to grab one of those. Hydrating is important. Talk amongst yourselves. All right. I have returned with a fine vintage ginger ale. Delicious. Those of you wondering why there was a difference between my video last night and tonight, my uncle in Newburyport unfortunately had to leave early to go south because there was a nor'easter that left me in a bit of a pickle, and I kind of had to find this particular set to be able to go off of today. This is at the basement of my wife's parents' house. Don't ask about the hookah. I have no idea. Anyway, without further ado, stave 2. If I make it through. Nor'easter is a very bad storm. It's not quite a blizzard, but can do just about as much damage. Oh, Deej, if only. I'm a family-friendly stream. Okay, let's get back to it. Hopefully I'm not boring you guys to tears. I can't see your feedback while I'm reading, so somebody sent me a Discord message if for some reason we lose connection. Stave 2, the first of the 3 spirits. Damn, I'm dried out. Ahem. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that, looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes, and when the chimes of a neighboring church struck 4 quarters, he listened for an hour. So he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12? It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gotten into the works. 12? He touched the spring in his repeater to correct this most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12 and stopped. Why, it is impossible, said Scrooge, that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon. The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off of the sleeve of his dressing gown, and before he could see anything, or could see very little then, all he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was the first great relief, because 3 days after the sight of this first exchange paid to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge, or his order, and so forth, would have become a mere United States security if there were no days to count by. That made no sense to me. Scrooge went to bed and thought and thought and thought it over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again, like a strong spirit released, to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Now Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3 quarters more, when he remembered, on a sudden, that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. Oh shit. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that he could no more go to sleep than he would go to heaven, this is perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced that he must he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. Ding dong! A quarter past, Scrooge counted. Ding dong! Half past. Ding dong! A quarter to it. Ding dong! Ah, the hour itself, said Scrooge triumphantly. And nothing else. Come on. He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy one. Of course, at this moment, light flashed up from the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn inside, I tell you, by a hand. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn inside, and Scrooge, starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them. As close to it as I am to you now, I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, yet the face had not a wrinkle on it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, and the hands the same, and as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were like those upper members bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with the summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprang a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, and in its duller moments the great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not in its strangest quality. For its belt sparkled and glittered now in one part and then in another, and that was the light one instant, at another time a head, now like a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. And in the very wonder of this, it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if instead of being so close behind him, it was at a distance. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of his dwarfish nature. "No, your past." Dwarfish nature. "No, your past." Perhaps Scrooge could have told anybody why, if anybody could have asked, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap, and begged him to be covered. "What?" exclaimed the ghost. "Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? It is not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap, and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow. Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intentions to offend or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit to any period of his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him here. "Your welfare," said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said that immediately. "Your reclamation, then. Take heed." It put out its strong me. It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes. That bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing. That he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown and nightcap, and that he had had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped its robes in supplication. I am immortal, Scrooge remonstrated, and liable to fall. Bear but a touch of my hand there, said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, and you shall be upheld in more than this. As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road, with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished, not a vestige of what was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, and for it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground. Good heavens, said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. I was bred in this place. I was a boy here. The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long and forgotten. Your lip is trembling, said the ghost. And what is that upon your cheek? Scrooge muttered, with an unusual catching in his voice. It was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. You recollect the way? Inquired the spirit. Remember it? Cried Scrooge with fervor. I could walk it blindfold. Strange to have forgotten it for so many years, observed the ghost. Let us go on. They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, its winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were seen trotting towards them with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other, until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. These are but shadows of things that have been, said the ghost. They have no consciousness of us. The Jocund travelers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named every one of them. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why did his cold eye glisten and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas as they parted at crossroads and byways for their several homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas, what good had it ever done to him? You know, the school's not quite deserted, said the ghost. The solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still. Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick with a little weathercock-surmounted cupola on the roof, and a bell hanging from it. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes. For the spacious offices were little used, their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. Chickens clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach houses and sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it a more retentive of its ancient state within, for entering this dreary hall and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold, and vast. There was an earthly savor in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting caught up by candlelight. which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. Sorry about that little run-on sentence there. They went, and the ghost and Scrooge. Maybe I did put a little something in here, I'm not gonna lie. Loosens the vocal cords. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room made barer still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these, a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he had used to be. Not a latent echo in the house, not a squeak and a scuffle from the mice behind the paneling, not a drip from the half-thawed waterspout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar. Not the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door. No, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with softening influence and gave a freer passage to his tears. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window, with an axe struck in his belt, and leading by the bridle an ass laden with wood. That ass. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Baba. Yes, yes, I know. One Christmas, when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come, and for the first time, just like that. Poor boy, and Valentine," said Scrooge, "and his wild brother Orson. There they go. And what's his name? The one who put down his drawers asleep at the gate of Damascus. Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom turned upside down by the genie. There he is upon his head. Serve him right, I'm glad of it. What business had he married to the princess?" I'm just reading it, guys. To hear Scrooge expending all of the earnestness of his nature on such subjects, in a most extraordinary voice, between laughing and crying, to see his heightened and excited face would have been a surprise to his business friends of the city indeed. There's the parrot," cried Scrooge. "Green body and yellow tail, with a thing like a lettuce growing out of the top of its head. There he is. Poor Robinson Crusoe, he called him, when he came home again after sailing round the island. Poor Robinson Crusoe. Where have you been, Robinson Crusoe?" The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday, running for all of his life to the little creek. Halla, hoop, halloo. Then, with a rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, he said, in pity for his former self, "Poor boy," and cried again. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him after drying his eyes with his cuff. "It's too late for me now." "What's the matter?" asked the spirit. Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night, and I should like to have given him something, that's all." The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved his hand, saying as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and a little more dirty. The panels shrank and the windows cracked. Fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and naked laths were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so that there he was alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl much younger than a boy came darting in, and putting her arms around his neck, often kissing him, addressed him as "Dear, dear brother." "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to To bring you home, home, home. Home, little fan, returned the boy. Yes, said the child, brimful of glee. Home for good and all. Home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be. That home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should. And he sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man, said the child, opening her eyes, sorry, and are never to come back here. But first, we'll be together all of Christmas long and have the merriest time in all of the world. You are quite a woman, little fan, exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed, and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him, in her childish eagerness, towards the door, and he, nothing loth to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, bring down Master Scrooge's box, then. And in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with a ferocious condescension and threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of a shivering best parlor that had ever been seen, where the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered installments of those dainties to the young people, at the same time sending out a meager servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he had thanked the gentleman, but if it was the same tap he could have tasted before, he had rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk being by this time tied on top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster goodbye right willingly, and getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, and quick wheels dashing the hoarfrost? The hoarfrost. Yes. Beware the hoarfrost. Don't know why I get stuck on that word. The hoarfrost, the snow from off the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray. Always a delicate creature whom a breath might have withered, said the ghost, but she had a large heart. So she had, said Scrooge. You're right. I will not gainsay it, spirit, God forbid. She died a woman, said the ghost, and had, as I think, children. One child, Scrooge returned. True, said the ghost. Your nephew. Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind and answered briefly, yes. Although they had put but that moment left the school behind them and were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city, where it was made plain enough by the dressing of their shops that here too it was Christmas time again. But it was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. I know it. I apprenticed here. They went in. At the sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind a high desk, that if he had been 2 inches taller he might have knocked his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried in great excitement, Why, it's old Fezziwig, bless his heart! It's Fezziwig alive again! Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, Yo-ho there, Ebenezer! Dick! I think Dick's another guy. I don't think he's calling Scrooge a dick. Although he is. Scrooge's former self, now a grown young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentices. Dick Wilkins, to be sure, said Scrooge to the ghost. Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, that Dick. Poor Dick. Dear, dear. Yo-ho, my boys, said Fezziwig. No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up, cried old Fezziwig with a sharp clap of his hands, before a man can say Jack Robinson. You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged up the street with the shutters, 1, 2, 3, had them up in their places, 4, 5, 6, barred them and pinned them, 7, 8, 9, and came back before you could have gotten to 12, panting like racehorses. Hi-li-ho! Cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility. Clear away, my lads, and let's have a lot of rooms here. Hi-li-ho, Dick. Cheer up, Ebenezer. Clear away. There was nothing they couldn't have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away, with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off, as if it were dismissed from public life forevermore. The floor was swept and watered. The lamps were trimmed. Fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright as a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. Damn it! In came a fiddler with a music book and went to his lofty desk and made an orchestra of it, and turned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovely. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook, and in came the brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected of not having brought enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door, but one who was proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. I think they're trying to say they're dancing. Old top couples always turning up in the wrong places. New top couples starting off again as soon as they got there. All top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. Okay, this might be getting a little. Let's just say that I'm reading this in a much different way. I'm kidding. Well done, the fiddler plunged. The fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, specially provided for that particular purpose. Porter for a particular purpose. But scorning rest, upon his reappearance, he instantly began again, though there were no dancers yet, as if the other fiddler had been carried home exhausted on a shutter, and he were a brand new man, resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. There were more dances, and there were more forfeits, and more dances, and then there was cake, and then there was negus, and then there was a great piece of cold roast, and then there was a great piece of cold boiled, and then there were mince pies and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and the boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog, mind you, that sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told him, struck up a Sir Roger de Coverley, and then old Fezziwig stood up to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple, too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them. 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners. People who were not to be trifled with. People who would dance and had no notion of walking. But if they had been twice as many, 4 times, old Miss Fezziwig would have been a match for them, or old Fezziwig would have been a match for him, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. If that's not high praise, tell me higher, and I will use it. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any given time what would come of them next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone all through the dance, Advance and retire, both hands to your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, back again to your place. Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs and came upon his feet again without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, his domestic ball broke up. Sorry, I'm not talking about somebody breaking their balls. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wishing him or her a Merry Christmas. When everyone had retired that you were apprentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter of the back shop. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the brightest faces of his former self and Dick, were turned from them, that he remembered the ghost and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon its head burnt very clear. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small?" echoed Scrooge. The spirit signed to him to listen to the two apprentices who were pouring out their hearts in praise of old Fezziwig, and when he had done so, said, "Why, is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "Isn't it that?" said Scrooge, heated by the remark, and speaking unconsciously like his former, not the latter self. "It isn't that, spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. To say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count them up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a small fortune." He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. "What's the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing particular," said Scrooge. "Something, I think," the ghost insisted. No. I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all." His former self turned down the lamps as he gave utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in open air. "My time grows short," observed the spirit. "Quick!" This is not addressed to Scrooge or to anyone whom could see it, but it produced an immediate effect, for again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, and a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of his later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye, which showed the passion that had taken root and where the shadow of growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, whose eyes were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. "It matters little," she said softly. "To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if I can cheer and comfort you in time to come, I would like to have tried to do, but I have no just cause to grieve." "What idol has displaced you?" he rejoined. "A golden one." "This is the even-handed dealing of the world," he said. "There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, that there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth." "You fear the world too much," she answered gently. "All of your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not?" "What then?" he retorted. "Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? Am I not changed towards you?" She shook her head. "Am I?" I don't get that last paragraph. Woo! We're at page 50. Let's take a look. I got to see exactly where we're going to be ending off here. I want to give you guys like a general idea of the time we'll be finishing. We're about an hour and a half in, 50 pages. I was actually thinking we'd be done by now. So I apologize for that. We are at the halfway mark. 50 pages, and we got 112. So I think maybe we break this into 2 parts. What say you? Would you guys prefer me to continue? And we probably have about another hour and a half left. Or would you guys want me to split this up? Maybe do the second half when I get back to California. Well, I'm just thinking of my poor voice right now. But what do we got here? We got a whole 8 people. Thought we'd have just a few more. Yeah, let's split it up. Well, we'll call this part 1 done. We're at page 50. Everybody keep a pin in that. Probably won't have the same lovely accoutrements, but let's do that. Let's do the other half of this, maybe a little closer to Christmas. So I'm going to leave that there. Again, hey, let's take a look here. Sigurdu. Well, let's have a little live information. We've got a donation that came in from Sigurdu, or Dagathur, over in the UK, and the amount of $15. Thank you. I will get that right out to Toys for Tots as soon as I have a chance to put my girls to bed. So yeah, I mean, obviously, guys, this has been fun. I wish that I had thought to bring a very, very large cask of water with me. Let's take a look here. I've got nothing else here, but let's take a second. Close up the old digital book and have a little chat. Let's talk about our history. I figured go freeform. A few years ago, a little game by the name of Ark Survival Evolved came out. And, well, some of us started as beach bobs. Some of us went on to become mini alphas. Some of us got our asses steamrolled. Thank you, Server 321. Taught me that maybe unofficial was what I should be doing. If you guys didn't notice, this is a little history of Jinx and how I became the owner, head admin, whatever have you, of Waking Realms. This is a quick little history. So, I left server 321 official, and I went off to a private server hosted in the great state of Texas, Tejas, and it was great. It was great for about 3 weeks. 3 weeks until we found out that the guy who was running the server gave the admin command to all his buddies. So we went and we got raided, not wiped, pretty damn close though. Really didn't have a whole lot back then. We proceeded to group up with like 10 other people on the server. We completely leveled their base. They stopped it. They literally shut the server down and rolled it back right away. It's hilarious. We decided we were done playing that way. And I was about this close to giving up Ark altogether. It's like, this game's fun. I love riding dinosaurs. Living the dream of freaking Dino Riders. Some cartoon from the 80s. Look it up. You'll basically see that anybody who was a kid in the 80s that was like the shit. Like, I'm gonna ride on the back of a T-Rex, and the T-Rex has got laser eyes. That's what it was. Anywho, so I said, maybe I'll try a role-playing server. Somebody in one of my groups said, try role-playing server. So I was like, where am I gonna find a role-playing server? So I went and I looked, and on the front of the PlayArc subreddit, they had only one role-playing server that was being shown. And that was Art Factions. So I dusted off the old role-playing hat. I pulled out the name of an old character of mine by the name of Martino Jinx, who has an origin from Dungeons and Dragons as a, oh God help me, because my skin is too white to say this and make myself sound slightly racist. I was a Hispanic halfling who had a penchant for stealing wagon wheels and large dwarven women. Yeah. Come on, it's D&D, right? You gotta have your, yeah. Anyway, so, except I re-envisioned him. I said, I'm gonna be a chef. Who role plays as a chef? Nobody, that's who. And, there's a bunch of more history between that, but I'm not going to go through all that. Long story short, I became a chef. I threw some of the best ragers, the best parties. I had the original Green Moss Tavern, which some of you old people been around since those days. You used to know everybody'd come to the Green Moss, have a little shoot the shit, chat, little RP. Maybe we go out on a booze cruise. Maybe we go out on a Quetzal base jumping expedition just for shits and giggles. And then things got a little weird. We had some admins get added and some admins get subtracted. There was a whole lot of weird ass drama that happened, and I offered up my hat to help. Halissa, our wonderful, beautiful, amazing admin that she is, had recently been added to the admin team, and I got added, ironically, as, how do I put this? I've always been a person who's tried to approach things from a neutral perspective, and the person who wanted me to be an admin wanted to do so because she thought that I would side with her all the time, which was not the case right from the get-go when I joined on board. And she left, and the group had dwindled down to 3 or 4 people, and things got weird, and people had gone to different servers and stopped playing Ark, because that's just the way that Ark is. You either play or you don't. And then we found out from the owner that, hey, we had people who were paying the bill every month, and now we don't. So it was like, holy shit, like, how much time do we have? They're like, I don't know, we prepaid with all this money that people were donating. Apparently it must have been a lot. But at that point, I had found their server provider. I started an account with them in Germany. We migrated everything over. I think that was the birth of Waking Realms. We renamed and we rebranded because Factions was kind of like its own thing. And we kept it like that for about a year, maybe a little bit longer. We were paying like $60 a month, just stupid amounts of money for this server in Germany. Which, 60 isn't a lot, but, is what it is. And at that point, we were all chipping in, so that's what ends up happening. And then I leave because I end up having a kid. Kids, too. Jesus, my wife heard me, she kicked my ass. She's right upstairs. And then when I came back, I decided that I was going to build a server box, hardware. Because all I wanted to do was make sure that no matter what we did, the server would live on. We've had lots of great people, lots of great friends. I mean, I can think of half dozen just off the top of my head that have come and gone, that some of them I do still count as friends, and some of them that just, acted like a bunch of prepubescent teens and decided to be dickheads and just leave. But that's okay. That's just part of growing up. And that's part of everything, It's like, never look at a person leaving a server as the end of the world, because there's always people to play. As long as there's those who like to role play, there will always be Awakening Realms. So I guess I'll just leave it at that for now. And we'll pick this back up later. I'll give you guys a heads up to part 2. And yeah, stay frosty. I'm kidding. Don't stay frosty. It's freezing. It's freezing like crazy here. I will give you guys video and live feed later when that nor'easter comes in, just so you guys can see the crazy shit that's about to happen. Yeah, on that note, I'll talk to y'all later. I'm gonna go get some sleep. Put my kids to bed. I need to get a shut-off button. I need an adult. How do I stop this thing going live? There's the X button. Oh, God. Where is it, Morty? I gotta get out of here. Ah, jeez, Rick. I don't know what's going on. Shut up, Morty. Just shut off the camera.